Alkander's Almanac of All Things is out. If you don't know what this is, it is basically an expansion to the Dungeon Master's Guide by the Dungeon Coach with some pretty cool contributors, most notably Brennan Lee Mulligan, who I believe helped with the adversity system. Let's do a quick overview of the book and see what all's in here and what you're going to be getting if you decide to purchase this book. There are 9 chapters in this book, starting with 0, which works because chapter 0 is how to use this book. Not too much to talk about on the chapter 0, but some pretty good information if you're looking for a guide on session zeros or a checklist. Next up, we move into chapter 1, which are just general rules. He covers everything from jumping, falling, potions, help actions, attunement, and much more. One of my favorite things from this chapter would be his new potion system. I'm not going to give the whole thing of the potion system away, but here is an example of some of the changes you might make to the potions. One of the reasons I like this is actually very close to a system that I use. Here's his table, and then here is my table that I've been using for a while. We had similar ideas here, though his you still roll on, which is cool because he gives some other options later on with things that you can do with that and potential bonuses that characters can get. Some interesting things that I had never thought of to do with potions. I also like some of his customizing character stuff that he goes over. One of them is just ideas for adjusting spellcasting modifiers, which I'm a big fan of. I currently have a Kalishtar who is somewhat inspired from Jedi's, and so I switched the wizard spellcasting modifier to wisdom, and it's more like the Force guides them. And so I'm a fan of customizing characters and letting your players do cool things with their characters like that. Next, looking at chapter 2, this is just an inspiration overhaul. It is a bunch of modifications that you can make to the current inspiration system if you don't like it, or a brand new system if you just want to completely overhaul it or revamp it. This chapter is not too long, but it is super good. My highlight from this chapter is what he calls heroic inspiration, which I'll give an example of here. And I had never thought of using inspiration like this before, so I thought that this was a really cool idea where you can let your players use inspiration to do epic things. And it's something to note, he says he would not recommend using all of these rules. These are just a bunch of optional rules that you can look at and decide which ones feel appropriate for you and your table. Which is kind of a side note of something that I really like about this book, and something that the Dungeon Coach did is throughout this book, he gives examples on how to implement this in your table and tips for remembering things or tables, what you should add to your Dungeon Master screen, which, side note, did a video on that if you're using Foundry and you want to add things to your Dungeon Master screen really easily. But yeah, let's get back into it. Moving on to chapter 3, we're getting on to skill challenges and setting DCs and all of that stuff. This was probably my favorite chapter of the book. First off, in this is the best written out guide for skill challenges. People have talked about them. There's videos on them. This is the best guide if you've never run a skill challenge before and you're wanting to introduce that to your players. This is an excellent resource for you and a lot of good information and tips on running skill challenges. The next is also gives chase scene rules, which are very different than anything that I've ran before. But if I run a chase scene or if a chase scene might happen, I'm actually going to try these out because I think that they look really fun. And he does a good job of kind of capturing the epicness that should happen in a chase. Then he also gives guides on setting DCs and different ways to handle DCs opposed to just a single roll. Did you hit the DC? Did you succeed? Did you fail? My favorite one that I'm going to call out is Erosion DC. Here's what he says about Erosion DC. Basically what this means is that the DC isn't beat or over until you whittle it down to 0. The way that you get the DC to drop is, well, basically by beating it. And it drops by the amount that you beat it, or the amount that you got over the DC. So if the DC is set to 20 and you roll a 22, you beat the DC, now it's down to 18. And then if you rolled a 22 again, you now beat it by 4, so now it's down to 14. And you continue going through this while the DC continues dropping. And as I was reading this chapter, I just started getting these battle scenes playing out in my head. And as I was reading some of his examples, I was just envisioning this battle where you could have something like a gem or a crystal that's in the middle of the room. And as the players get in, the doors shut, they're locked in there. And weapons and suits of armor start getting animated and are attacking them, and it's powered by this crystal, and every round maybe 3 more objects get animated and start fighting the characters. So then the players have to decide, do they try to destroy the crystal so that they can actually end the combat? But if they ignore all the objects getting animated each round, more and more are getting added into the fight, and they could quickly become overwhelmed if they don't have people that are being dedicated to the fight. And the erosion DC could be that around this crystal is a sphere or a protective barrier, and maybe the wizard's having to make spellcasting checks to wear that DC down to where they can finally destroy the crystal and end the combat. Now, I would probably make some adjustments to that scene before actually running it to make sure that it was cool and balanced. But as I was reading that, I was just getting tons of ideas and inspired for really cool scenes that I could run with my players. So this was probably my favorite chapter, and there are far more DC methods than just the erosion DC that he mentions in this. So if you like that, there's probably a lot more in here that you will also like. Chapter 4, 5, and 6 are all on the main pillars of the game. Starting with chapter 4, he goes into social encounters. In social encounters, this is, again, a very good guide, especially if you're a newer dungeon master and you're not sure how to roleplay things, or even if you've been playing for a while and your roleplaying's getting a little bit stale, or you want tips for new players, because he gives tips on roleplaying. He gives a disposition system, he gives a reputation system, and that adversity system I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of good information in this chapter 4, including how to add social encounters into the other pillars. Your combat doesn't have to just be combat. You can add a social encounter into your combat. Exploration, you can add social encounters, and he gives tips for doing that. And that is kind of my highlight for chapter 4, is how to include social encounters into some of the other pillars. It might be that they meet a helpful NPC or anything. Then moving on to chapter 5, we have exploration. This is one of the longest chapters of the book, so here's the outline of the chapter and a lot of the stuff that he goes over. Tons of information in here. This is, huge chapter. And again, he even calls out, you should not use everything in here. And this is one of those specific chapters that you may pick certain things to do, or what he mentions is you might use these rules for certain sections of the game. So he gives rules on basically survival, inventory tracking, supplies, rations, all of that stuff. And maybe you only use that if you're going through a desert, or if you're going to be doing something where that's a big deal. Then you don't really track all that stuff for the rest of the campaign when it doesn't matter as much and it's just tedious. He also gives a new wealth system, as well as a guide on travel and downtime. And I really liked his perspective in ways to run downtime that might be a little bit quicker than some alternative options. My highlight for this chapter is his rest system. So here's the summary of the rest system. It is very similar to what I've been using for quite some time, and I really enjoy it. Basically, shortens the duration of a short rest to 10 minutes of just no activity. So this is more just like catching your breath. You're not having to actually hang out for a full hour, but you only get 2 short rests in a day. And the main difference of a long rest is that you don't naturally heal. You only get half of your hit die back, and you have to use your hit die to heal up. You don't fully heal or fully rest up until you use a full rest, which is, I do 24 hours. He says 24 hours to a week of downtime. Your players have to take some time off. I really like this also because it can encourage your players actually taking downtime and doing some of these other stuff. So then moving on to chapter 6, which is combat. And this is another hefty chapter. Here are all the things that he covers in combat. It is mind-blowing. Obviously, you are not going to use all of these rules because you wouldn't be playing 5e if you used everything. But if there's something you don't like about combat, he probably has an alternative way to run it, and a lot of them are really good. If the skill challenges were not my favorite chapter, then this would probably be my favorite chapter. This one's really good. But looking at chapter 6, going into combat, I like when people introduce stuff that I've just never thought of before or never heard of before. And so, of course, that's gonna be the spell duels. I've just always ran spells very rules as written. That is the thing I've homebrewed the least, is how spells work. And I really like the example he gives of spell duels. I'll also show you his revision to counterspell so that you can see kind of how this works a little bit. But I've never liked counterspell. I like his idea for how counterspell could work. Or you can do these spell duels where you have these epic moments where you're kind of battling things out with the baddie. I think that this is a really cool option for running spellcasters and how their fights could be much better then basically who runs out of counterspell first. Something to note on his change for counterspell is in order to counterspell, the spell has to be cast with a casting time of 1 action or longer. The reason that this is important is because that means that you cannot counterspell a counterspell. Keeps the fights a little more epic and less nothing happening. All right, so then moving on to chapter 7, what's he gonna follow up combat with? Mass combat. My goodness. He outdid himself on mass combat. The way I always ran mass combat, about a year and a half ago, I would have absolutely loved to get my hands on this book to read his ideas for mass combat because I could not figure out a good way to do mass combat. I ended up just running it basically scenes. Mass combat consisted of the players running through like 3 scenes. He gives a relatively simple and in-depth system for running mass combat, which is just wonderful. If you're running a campaign where mass combat may happen, this is probably worth it alone for you. And then what are we gonna end things with? Of course, we're gonna end it with death and resurrection. Here's the outline. I love that he goes into mental and physical stress of death and resurrection because it should be a big deal. You don't just die and get brought back with nothing happening. If that's what you want at your table, again, you don't have to run it that way, but if you feel like death and resurrection should be a bigger deal, this chapter is awesome. He also gives some options for ways that you can do death saves, and depending on what dropped them, you know, if they're poisoned while they're making death saves, things like that. My highlight for this is something very similar to what I currently use, but he, of course, went a step further and added something that I really like. Whenever you get knocked unconscious, when you stabilize or wake back up, you get an added level of exhaustion. That is how I run it. But he gives the option that you can make a DC Constitution saving throw upon returning to consciousness to see if you suffer the level of exhaustion or not, which I actually really like because it feels a little harsh that you just get a level of exhaustion, nothing you can do about it. So I actually like the option of making a Constitution saving throw to get a level of exhaustion. And that is the last chapter. So now that we've finished going through each of the chapters, just some of my thoughts on this. It is the best expansion or add-on I have ever read for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. It's better than most of the official books. You can really see the passion that the Dungeon Coach has for D&D. You can tell that he plays the game, that he loves playing the game, and the alternate options for how to run certain rules. This is a super good book, and I'm not trying to sell you this book. I've never talked to the Dungeon Coach before. I don't have an affiliate link or anything like that. I am just a fan of his, and his book did not let me down. If you want to buy the book, I will include a link to where you can buy the PDF version, which is available right now. And if you want a hardcover of the book, you only have, I believe he said you only have until the end of July to pre-order it, and then it's done. He said he's only doing 1 printing of it. And so if you want a hard copy of it, I'll include a link in the description for where you can get that, but it has to be this month. Here on the screen, you'll see the pricing for each one, depending on if you want to buy it or not. I purchased this book. It wasn't given to me, and I have absolutely no regrets. I thought this was an excellent book. That's all I have. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.